to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Northfield. My name is Sue Coleman, and I have been a member for 3 years. Thank you for being a part of my life. UUFN is an inclusive community that nurtures spiritual and intellectual growth and fosters ethical and social responsibility. If you are a visitor either on site or online, we are glad you are with us, and we invite you to stay after the service to get acquainted. We welcome your questions and look forward to getting to know you. I call your attention to the announcements in your order of service and weekly email. Enjoy a lovely day on Lake Billsby, Saturday, August 12th at noon. Mary Dorr invited us to her house near Cannon Falls. Please bring food to share for a potluck. Mary will provide beverages and watermelon. There will also be a pontoon cruise on the lake. If you want to swim, bring a swimming suit, towel, and a lawn chair if you want to sit outside. All ages are welcome. And I'm very excited. I've never been to Mary's, so I'll be there. There will be a welcoming congregation conversation next Sunday, August 13th, after the service at UUFN. In response to an online conversation about LGBTQ+ identities, terminology, and welcoming, let's gather in person to talk about these concepts. Reverend Sarah will do an overview of terminology and concepts, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and reflection. Join us next Sunday, August 13th, for Opening Our Minds to Learn What is True, presented by Paul Krause. This presentation is the third and final service in Krause's Chancel Lighting series. This service is a natural extension of his early services, which focused on openings of the eyes and heart. Now, I tried to get Paul to tell me if there was a surprise ending or something, in this, but he's being mum, so we're gonna have to come to find out what happens. The service will include music, song, poetry, and possibly dance, all contributed by our talented members. Again, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Northfield. A special welcome to our guest speaker today, Meleah Houseknecht. In 2021, she began the journey of following her call to Unitarian Universalist ministry, and she is about to start her third year at United Theological Seminary. Before seminary, she spent 2 decades engaging stakeholders in environmental policy development and implementation, and she holds a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment. Meleah grew up in a small UU fellowship in Morganton, West Virginia, and has attended or been connected to several other UU communities across the Northeast and New England. As of 2011, she settled in South Minneapolis, where she now resides with her husband, Seth, a professor at St. Olaf, 2 young children, and 2 rambunctious kittens. When not studying or parenting her human and furry children, Meleah serves Unitarian Universalism as the co-chair of the Faithful Action Council at First Universalist Church of Minneapolis, and a trustee for Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. The title of her sermon, which we'll hear in just a bit, is The Transient and Permanent in Unitarian Universalism. Welcome, Meleah.
Our opening words are from For Nothing is Fixed by James Baldwin. For nothing is fixed, forever and forever and forever. It is not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born, and we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have.
The flaming chalice is the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. Each Sunday, when we gather, we bring this symbol to life together. Please join me in speaking the words for the lighting of the chalice. Let us open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Let's open our minds to learn what is true. Let us open our hearts to love one another.
So to start our time of worship together, we're going to watch and hear A Change is Coming, written by Molly Bajgot and performed by Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout, Allison Hellers, and Karishma Gottfried, who's a fellow UU seminarian, and put together this beautiful arrangement of the song. And the lyrics come from the words of Adrienne Marie Brown out of her book, Emergent Strategy. Change is coming, she says. What do we need to imagine to be prepared? It's an imagination exercise that she proposes we engage in to prepare for a world on the other side of unsustainable extractive capitalism. What can we imagine?
Change is coming. What do we need to imagine? Change is coming. What do we need to imagine? 'Cause I know from brokenness there's hope. I know from brokenness there's hope. Change is coming. What do we need to imagine? Change is coming. What do we need to imagine? To be prepared. I know I'm scared to be prepared. I know I'm scared. is coming. What do we need to imagine? Change is coming. What do we need to imagine? Change is coming. What do we need to imagine? Change is coming. What do we need to imagine?
I invite you to allow yourself an unhurried breath. Relax your shoulders. Inhale and exhale, and let your heart catch up with you in this moment. In the presence of a love that holds us all, we use our chancel flame to light our candles of community. We light our first candle of concern for the wider world, for citizens caught in the conflicts and violence in Africa and elsewhere. We know too that the details of our daily lives are sacred and important. We now light a candle for all the simple joys that are sustaining us. And we light another candle in honor of the sorrows and hardships we might be carrying. One more candle in honor of the joys and sorrows we carry in our hearts, but have not been spoken aloud. And we move into a time of silence. May the truth of your heart be reflected in these flames. Amen, and blessed be. Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light works in partnership with multi-faith communities to co-create a just and sustainable world by addressing the climate crisis. Since its founding in 2004, Interfaith Power and Light has grown the multi-faith climate movement in Minnesota and across the United States by empowering communities to take action that is authentic, effective, and energizing in their context. This is done in two ways: leadership development programs for communities, adults, and youth, and action opportunities that provide tangible ways to make an impact. UUFN is using the Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light to provide local legislative action opportunities to supplement the UU Green Sanctuary Program, moving UUFN forward to live our faith and values through effective and sustained action on climate justice. Let us give generously as we are able to support Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light.
In her book, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, Adrienne Marie Brown draws heavily on science fiction writer Octavia Butler's Earthseed theology. Octavia Butler wrote, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." But at the center of this theology is not just the idea that change is the defining and ultimate power, but that we can shape change through deliberate action. Butler also wrote, "Chaos is God's most dangerous face, amorphous, roiling, hungry. Shape chaos, shape God. Act, seize change, use it, adapt, and grow." Adrienne Marie Brown points out that most of us have been socialized to understand that constant growth, violent competition, and critical mass are the ways to create change. But emergence, she says, shows us that adaptation and evolution depend more upon critical, deep, and authentic connections, a thread that can be tugged for support and resilience. The quality of connection between the nodes in the patterns, dare I say love. And we know how to connect. We long for it. Unitarian Universalism teaches us that as part of an interconnected whole, we have the power to change that whole. In fact, we can't help but change it. If all that we touch we change, then to faithfully shape change, we must take responsibility for and bring intentionality to the ways that we change the world every day. We must be attentive to the impacts of our actions and have the courage to live as if what we choose to do is profoundly important. Without creed or canon, ours is a faith tradition that rests on our shared commitment to shape change based on a set of shared values, to transformation of the world through liberating love. So now we're going to take just a few minutes to tap into our own change-shaping powers. First, I invite you to close your eyes or soften your gaze. You can turn off your camera if you're joining us online. Feel the weight of your body as it presses down on the floor, your chair. Take a moment to find the natural rhythm of your breath. Now think of a time that you shaped change, that you intentionally made a difference to a person, a place that is sacred to you, or on a decision that you impacted. Think about a time when something or someone took a different course because of your presence. And sit with that memory for a few seconds. Now take a moment to find the place in your body where you feel the most moved or enlivened when you think about that experience of shaping change. What does it feel like? Taut readiness, warmth? Is it a rising feeling or a falling feeling or a flow? Does it reach outward or inward? Is it forceful or tender? Take a minute to bask in the glow of that change-shaping power. As you prepare to rejoin the group, I want you to place your hand and put it on the place that you feel most associated with that shaping of change, and put a little bit of pressure. You can do that literally or metaphorically, but I want you to remember that spot so that you can find it later. And then when you have saved that spot or that feeling to memory so that you can find it when you need it, I want you to feel free to open your eyes, turn your camera back on, or otherwise rejoin the group. So as Sue mentioned in my bio, I grew up attending a Unitarian Universalist fellowship, quite a bit smaller than this one actually, which makes me what I've heard called a cradle or a birthright UU. Now, yeah, many of us who were raised UU in my 20s and in my early 30s, I was honestly pretty sporadic about attending church. But as I moved around for school and work, I actually did find myself seeking out UU communities. Like people throughout history, having a religious identity gave me a sense of solidity and belonging to something. There was stability and comfort in being able to find groups of like-minded people that I could read poetry and sing with on a Wednesday night. This did not require joining a church at a time in my life when I, like many of my middle-class educated peers, was decidedly transient. Permanence, I thought, at the time was to be found in the principles. That's what makes us UU, right? And I found reassurance in knowing that there was a reliable way to find people who were like me. I presumed that to mean people who wanted the experience of religion, and without any sign of supernatural belief or discomforting attempts to make antiquated and, in my estimation at that time, thoroughly paternalistic stories relevant to my 21st century life. It wasn't until my late 30s when my first child began to form ideas of their own that I finally joined a church. And I was surprised to find that I was the only person in my group of a dozen or so new members that was actually raised UU. It was as an adult and a church member that I came to really fully understand the degree to which we are a faith movement of largely converts and to a very large degree of transients. Good statistics are hard to come by, but the little bit of research that has been done seems to suggest that less than 15% of those who are raised UU remain active in the movement, and those who join one UU congregation aren't particularly likely to continue congregational participation should they move or have a change of life circumstances. I've known a lot of comers and goers, and I bet you have too. There is far more about UU communities that is transient than is permanent. So given this, I have been somewhat surprised by the degree to which some in our congregations have formed possibly somewhat ossified notions of what Unitarian Universalism is at its core, what it is about our shared faith that should be seen as permanent, absolute, or essential, what it is that defines us as Unitarian Universalists. As it would be hard not to notice, Unitarian Universalism is at a moment in our history that is characterized by anything but permanence. After reaching a crisis point in 2017, we have been reckoning with the gap between our ideals of inclusion and plurality, our stated belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, in justice, equity, and compassion, and respect for the implications of deep and broad interdependence, and the reality of our interactions with one another through which our Black, brown, trans, and disabled siblings, among others, still experience harm and exclusion. We have been asking ourselves, what is required of us? What are we individually and collectively called to do? In some cases, to give up in order to become the beloved community that we strive to be. I recognize that it is not a time when many people are looking to be unsettled in their religious community, especially when the world is so full of change, unknowns, and the loss of places and institutions that we thought that we could count on. But I believe that we can navigate change together, and it helps to remember that we have undergone transformations in the plural before. We love to talk about being the living tradition, living faith tradition, the words and ideas that feel like such important anchors of shared meaning now came from people much like us, living in other historical contexts, who likewise faced the need to adapt for the sake of remaining relevant and meaningful in the evolving mosaic of human knowledge and human history. And lest we forget, the original 6 principles, of which really several were commitments of fellowship, not principles at all, were only written 64 years ago, in 1959, in the lead up to the merger of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America, when they were written into the bylaws of the newly formed Unitarian Universalist Association. That's where they show up, and we'll come back to that later. But that was far from the first time that we overcame division and moved through transformational change as a faith movement. Another 100 or 20 years before the merger, our Unitarian predecessors would have been unrecognizable to us today. Although they had split off from the other Congregationalists in 1825 by denying the unique divinity of Christ, they were very much still Christians, and they identified as non-creedal, but were absolutely still a biblical tradition. And from within their ranks emerged a generation of clergy and lay leaders who were young upstarts at the time that embraced the most liberal cultural movements of their day. And those upstarts were the Transcendentalists. And while the years since we have often celebrated them as perhaps the most influential and morally imaginative of our forebears, at the time they were marginalized and in many cases ridiculed or pushed out of Unitarian circles entirely, or they walked out, many of them. And I say that not to venerate them necessarily, but to acknowledge that it's one thing to look back with the benefit of hindsight and see when the time has come for new ideas and new language to take hold, but it's never easy to do that in the moment. Like any tradition, we can get attached to our traditions. And while Ralph Waldo Emerson tends to be the most widely remembered of the Unitarian Transcendentalists, it was Theodore Parker who is largely credited with having planted the subversive seeds that eventually overturned the soil of old guard Unitarianism and formed the new roots of an evolving movement. You probably know Parker from some of the very famous things he said later in his career as an abolitionist, but it was in 1841 that he broke with the Unitarian mainstream by delivering a speech titled "The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity." And in it, he made the case for an absolute religious truth that was outside of historical revelation, as in the Bible, right? And that depends on no single teacher, act, or event. Christianity is not a system of doctrines, he claimed, but rather a method of attaining oneness with God. Today, we take for granted this assertion that what is most essential about our spiritual experience is intrinsic, and that it can be accessed outside of Scripture, which is just one source of knowledge about religious truth and the human relationship to the divine. But at that time, it was a terrible embarrassment to the Unitarian establishment, whose leaders were largely still committed to belief in biblical miracles and who remained bulwarked against their disavowal as members of Christendom by their more orthodox peers. They were not ready to be kicked out of that club. Parker's decision to call his fellow ministers away from idolatry, venerating the Bible and Jesus as idols, to fully affirm Jesus's humanity, and to embrace a Christianity in which the only permanent religious truths were moral intuitions, led to his being permanently ostracized by his fellow Boston Unitarians. They felt they needed to defend that which they understood at the time to be central to their shared faith. We venerate him now, and they booted him out. According to historian of liberal theology Gary Dorian, while Parker's neo-Christian theology was a marginal position in the Unitarian Church at the end of his life in 1860, a half century later, it was the mainstream Unitarian perspective. American Unitarianism was transformed because what was a radical response to the social context and moral imperatives of Parker's time, abolition of slavery and women's suffrage, became central to the shared understanding of how we define ourselves as a distinct religious movement over the course of decades. What Parker described as permanent about Christianity can be boiled down to something that I think we have held on to. Love of man, love of God, he said. Now, we don't presume that everyone is a man anymore, thankfully, but we do still place love at the center of our shared values and shared theology. But I think that the attempt to capture and articulate permanence has been far less crucial to Parker's legacy than the reminder that the words, ideas, and images that we build around whatever it is we deem essential are not and should not be intended as permanent. As Parker reminds us, and this was 180 years ago, he said, "In respect of doctrines as well as forms, we see all is transitory. Opinions have changed most on points deemed most vital. Now who shall tell us that the change is to stop here? That this sect or that, or even all sects united, have exhausted the river of life and received it all on their canonized urns, so that we need draw no more out of the eternal well." But in shifting the focus from scripture and doctrines to a subjective feeling of divine connection and what he called holy living, Parker opened up a new set of questions about what it is that defines us as a community of shared values and ethics, yes, even if these are the transient concepts around which we build our institutions. And as you probably know, this is a critical time for Unitarian Universalism, just as it is for our imperiled democracy. Through the Article 2 Study Commission, which has a very bureaucratic name, but actually a very important job, we have opened up our foundational language for the necessary updates that are required to meet the needs of a new generation and a new historical moment. We are rewriting the article of our bylaws in which we have codified the definition of that which we share as Unitarian Universalists, which can feel, I'll admit, threatening or alienating to those of us who found this spiritual home based on the power and appeal of those words, or whose religious identities are tied to them. And that can constitute many or most of us. But this doesn't mean that we're changing what it means to be a UU. We're changing some of the words and constructs, which were last meaningfully updated in 1985, which is when the current principles and sources were written, and which were not intended to last more than a generation. And they already have. As part of the Article 2 update process, Reverend Dr. Meredith Garman has talked about the idea that because we as UUs are not only creedless, but canonless, what defines us is our covenant and how we decide to be with each other. And as Reverend Bill Sinkford has put it, the covenant is how we are together, not how we talk about how we are together. And Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray's words are, our covenants are imperfect articulations of what is universal transcendent. It is our attempt to express that, and we learn and change. And I might add that we will continue to. This won't be the last time we update that imperfect expression, which is why it thankfully doesn't need to be perfect. This is our chance to ask for a new time, one in which authoritarianism, white nationalism, and patriarchal control of bodily autonomy threaten even our yet inadequate progress towards liberation for all. What is transient, and what do we believe is permanent about our shared faith? What are we called to promise to one another? If we are going to be a beacon of hope and light, I hope we are and can be to each other and the world around us in a time such as this. Theodore Parker's charge echoes across nearly 2 centuries. The question puts itself to each person, he said, will you cling to what is perishing or embrace what is eternal? This year, we UUs get to answer this question together, and I want to acknowledge that this is not an easy task. What is most permanent about our living tradition may be its openness to transformation and to embracing divine change itself. God is change, maybe. Regardless, it's not mine or any of ours to determine on our own. What I do know is that our current principles and purposes were certainly not intended to be permanent, and they must adapt if they are going to be the central expression of that which defines us as a movement, not just committed to justice, but capable of advancing it in a rapidly changing world. And we do need to define ourselves. Only through knowing ourselves and defining our edges can we form meaningful relationships across difference, or recognize when we are building a more liberated and just world, not only for ourselves, but for everyone. As Unitarian Universalists, we have often defined ourselves as a denomination and as individuals, myself very much included, by that, at the doctrines and the dogma that we negate. Right now, we are faced with the joyous opportunity to instead affirm a new purpose and values, to renew that which is transient, as well as our shared understanding of what is permanent enough to bind us in covenant for the decades, but almost certainly not centuries to come. I hope you'll join me in embracing the hard yet beloved task of renewal of our essence as Unitarian Universalists, the ever-changing expressions of our shared faith, and the ever-changing story of who we want to collectively become. It will also be valuable practice for the sacred and enormously challenging work of renewing our democracy, which is a task that we will all continue to face in the years ahead. In his 2011 book, Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed put it this starkly: there are only two options, change or die. He summed it up well in the words he chose to end with. He said, change will come whether we work for it and celebrate it, or distrust and resist it, or simply wait. Our history says it will come whether we want it or not. For that, he says, we can be thankful. May it be so, and amen. Now, please rise in body or spirit and join me in singing We Shall Be Known by the California-based duo Mamuse. And we will be led by the UU The Vote How We Thrive virtual choir on the screens, and the lyrics are in your bulletin.
We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now
Now we join together in the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. We will continue to circle around these fires, the ones we tend inside ourselves, the ones that we use to shape change. There is much work to be done, and I am grateful to be here now with you to do it.
Please rise and body your spirit, and with your hands over your heart, holding the hand of those next to you, or whatever posture is most comfortable to you, we sing words of blessing to one another. Go in peace.